Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this program. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien, and it is a pleasure to be with you, as indeed it always is. It is a Monday. It is the last day of September in the year 2013, and it is also the eve of the government shutdown, apparently. So I don't know whether that's something to celebrate or something to... I think there are only a very, very few people that look upon this as something to celebrate. But unfortunately, the people who look at it that way are in a position to actually make sure it happens. So it appears that we are in for yet another government shutdown. The last one was 17 years ago. And what its overall impact will be is hard yet to measure. You will recall a few months ago that when the sequester occurred, it happened in segments, in increments, to the point that it was very, very difficult to measure the full impact because it was happening on a very, very gradual basis, which indeed is part of the reason why it could have even been considered. If it happened all at once, it would have been devastating. And the reason I'm saying that is because I'm suspecting that the shutdown will be the same. That gradually government offices will begin to close and shut down, and there'll be temporary furloughs on kind of an incremental basis. And of course, what that means is the full impact of the entire event is a little bit difficult to get your arms around for a while. And again, I think that's part of the reason that people are willing to bear the risk. Some people are willing to bear the risk of it because the full impact will take a while to be fully realized. So on this eve of that day, whatever that day might be, I'd like to welcome you to today's edition of the Virtual Center. And thank you for tuning in, as I always do, and encourage you, as I always do as well, to participate actively in our program. We have a phone number, and if you dial 304 area code 658-3333, that will get you into our Head-On Radio Network studios, and within a matter of seconds, we will have you on the air. All that will have to happen is that the folks in the studio will have to engage my attention in order to get me to stop talking for a moment in order to let you on. But that's no problem because I believe me, I would be, devastated if I found out that there was somebody on the line that couldn't get on because I couldn't keep from running my mouth, and obviously I do that quite a bit, and I would love to hear different voices. I know many of our listeners would as well. So please, if you are so inclined to share your ideas, your comments, your suggestions with our listeners as well as with me, then by all means, give us a call at area code 304-658-3333. If you'd like to exchange your ideas directly with me via email, I would be very, very glad to read your email, and if I can, in a responsible way to respond to whatever questions or comments you might have. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's all one word, waobrien906@gmail.com. I received an email from one of our listeners, from Betsy in Texas, I believe Friday or Saturday, right at the front end of the weekend, which was, weather-wise a wonderful weekend. My wife and I kind of escaped town on a 2-day excursion to a local state park here in southern West Virginia, and spent a couple of days away from everything, and it was wonderful, very honestly. And I will own up to the fact that I had a birthday this weekend, yesterday, in fact, and so that was kind of my wife's birthday present, as we would get away for a few days, and we would put the dog in the kennel for a couple of days and just kind of get away and forget about government shutdowns and anything else, and just enjoy good food and each other's company and walk in the woods, which we did. And it was wonderful. The weather was perfect, and it was a delight. And it's kind of it renews you, and I think everybody knows that. I need to be reminded occasionally because my wife more than once has mentioned the fact that I seem to be a workaholic. I'd never really thought about myself as being a workaholic, but I do enjoy reading, and I do enjoy writing, and I do enjoy preparing for a program like this or for the class that I'm teaching 3 days a week or whatever. So I'm not going to apologize for that, but I do realize realistically that it is necessary every once in a while to kind of come up for air and get away and do those kinds of things. So it was wonderful, and I'm back and I'm ready to go. Unfortunately, they're ready to shut down the government right out from under us, but somehow we'll make it. We usually do. And let me again tell you what a pleasure it is to be here, what a pleasure it is to have you listening to the Virtual Center, and very honestly, what an honor it is to think that there are intelligent people like the people that listen to this program and listen to the Head On Radio Network, who on a regular basis tune into the Virtual Center and are more than ready to engage and to reflect upon some of the issues and some of the concepts which I think are particularly relevant to the Constitution, related to the Constitution. That one of the issues that I want to deal with today is directly related to the Constitution, and I want to deal with that a little bit. But I really do appreciate. Again, I would love to hear from you. Our area code is 304, and the number again is 658-3333. I mentioned that I received an email from Betsy this weekend, and her email was a link to a review of a new book by Diane Ravitch, who is a professor of education and educational policy, I believe at NYU or Columbia, one or the other, and I'm kind of stuck for that detail right now. Diane Ravitch, for many, many years, has been kind of a guru in terms of education and what's happening in our schools. And for a long time, up until very, very recently, Diane Ravitch was a supporter of some of the policies coming out of Washington over the last several years related to our public education system. She was a supporter of the No Child Left Behind legislation that was passed during the Bush administrations, I'm sure you will recall. She's been a supporter of the Obama Department of Education priorities in terms of offering grant rewards, financial incentives for improving test scores on standardized tests and the rest of it. And it is only of late, in the last couple of years, that Diane Ravitch has kind of stepped away for a moment and reflected a little bit on some of the things that she's traditionally been supportive of, and is now coming out as a pretty pronounced critic on some of these things. A number of what were considered to be a few years ago reforms, she was in the forefront of those scholars and professional gurus, if you were, in the field of education, who supported things like lab schools, particular schools devoted to particular subjects and particular disciplines and those kinds of things, as well as standardized testing and all the rest of it. But she has pretty well come around and now is very, very skeptical of those things. And I'm going to step away for one moment, and I will be right back. I apologize for stepping away, but I had a copy. I printed out the review of Diane Ravitch's book, and I left it on another desk at the other side, on the other side of the room. So I wanted to go retrieve it. One of the areas that Diane Ravitch was particularly supportive of was charter schools. And of late, she has become a critic of charter schools for a lot of reasons. And part of the reason that she has become so critical of them is because many of the charter schools have become competitors with public school systems. The idea of the charter school movement when it first began was it was seen as a way to strengthen, via competition, public schools. That by setting up particular schools that were focused on a particular area, on a particular discipline, like the arts or the natural sciences or the social sciences or whatever, these charter schools, which were seen as lab opportunities to create kind of ideal situations in these disciplines, which in turn would become examples that public schools could mirror themselves around. And the idea was that the existence of the existence of charter schools would strengthen and support public schools and public education. But in effect, that didn't happen. What did happen is that many of the charter schools have become competitors of the public school system rather than supporters and aids to it, if that makes sense. Part of the reason is who heads up the charter schools. Many of them are with foundations or with well-heeled individuals who have put up some of their own money or corporate money to sponsor these things. And, of course, many of these people do not have their heart and soul in public schools at all or in public education generally. And so they tend to be very, very entrepreneurial spirited. And the consequence is that they put everything they have into the success of the charter schools, often at the expense of, rather than as an asset to, public school systems. And that's one of the reasons that Diane Ravitch has turned on the public schools. Her book, which is just coming out, is called Reign of Error. And what she's basically talking about is the criticism, the mistakes that we made in the privatization movement in education, and the danger that poses to the success and quality of our public schools throughout the country. And there's no question that now Diane Ravitch is a believer that we need to have quality public schools rather than alternative private school availability, if that makes sense. Recently, she was interviewed, and this particular review is based on that interview on NPR with Steve Inskeep, who's a journalist on public radio. And she makes the point that, instead of replacing public schools with nonprofit education, her feeling is now that what we need is smaller class sizes and better teachers in our public schools. In other words, we have to go back to improving our public schools, because what has happened is that because charter schools can accept or reject particular students, they tend to reject the students that the public schools can't reject. On the other hand, they tend to attract the students from the public schools that really make the public schools high quality or higher quality. In other words, they're drawing the best from the public schools, and they're leaving problem students and disabled students and foreign students for whom English is only a second language in the public schools. And the result is that the public schools are overwhelmed with low-performing students for a number of reasons, and thereby unable to escape the criticisms of them as being failing. In other words, all the things that would keep public schools from failing have been taken out of the public schools by the charter school movement and by privatization in education. And the result has been that public schools for a lot have been left floundering. And so therefore, they fulfill the expectation on the part of many that public schools, public education by definition is failing education. Diane Ravitch has now reached the point where she wants to turn that around. In response to a question as to why she disagrees with the charter school movement, she responded to Steve Inskeep as follows. What's wrong with charter schools, she says, is that they originally were supposed to be created to collaborate with public schools and help them solve common problems. Because they've now been taken over by the idea of competition, they've become part of the movement to turn education into a consumer product rather than a social and a public responsibility. What I mean is, she says, that you go shopping for a school. I don't believe in school choice, she says. I believe that every neighborhood should have a good quality public school. And if the parents don't want the good local public school and they want to send their child to a private school, they should be able to do so, but they should pay for it. In other words, what she's saying is by beefing up the quality of our public schools, those that are attending our public schools are not sacrificing anything to those whose parents can afford to send them to a private school. As far as whether charter schools have worked or not, or are working, Dr. Ravitch makes the comment and says, some charter schools are exceptional. Some charter schools are doing a great job. Many of them do worse than the local public schools, she says. Many charter schools are run by people who have no qualifications to be educators, and some charter schools are run by for-profit entrepreneurs who are making a lot of money. So, this is the question. So she has turned on the charter schools and on the privatization movement in public education. In response to a question as to why some public schools underperform and how to respond to that, she said the following. Some of them are bad, but the reason we call them bad is because they're serving disproportionate numbers of children with disabilities because the charter schools don't want them. They have disproportionate numbers of children who don't read or speak English because they're foreign born, and the charter schools don't want them either. So we're getting the public schools overloaded with low-performing children and then calling them failing schools. That's wrong, she said. Are there bad schools? If there are bad schools, she said, then the people whose feet should be held to the fire are the superintendents, the administrators of these schools, the people who run these systems. It's their job to identify schools that are really bad and change them and give that school the small class sizes they need, the guidance counselors they need, the extra resources they need, so that schools like this can serve the children better. I was particularly interested in this issue because she was asked in the interview about technology in the classroom. And I find this particularly telling. I'll explain why in a moment. I have no problem, she says, with good tools for teachers. My problem is that I know that there are now entrepreneurs and there are people in think tanks who are arguing quite publicly that these tools should replace teachers, and that if you buy enough of these tools, it will not only enrich the corporation, but it will make it possible for the school district to save money by having 100 kids on a tablet for one teacher, and that's a big saving for the district. And then she said, I think that that's not education. The best schools in the country are not replacing their teachers with computers or iPads or anything like that. As far as poverty as being the problem in public education, she says the following. Let me tell you what I think everyone needs to know. American public education, she says, is a huge success. Test scores have never been higher than they are today for white children, black children, Hispanic children, and Asian children. High school graduation rates have never been higher than they are today for all of those groups. Our schools are not failing, they are successful. Where there are low test scores, where there are higher dropout rates than the national average, is where there's concentrated poverty. Obviously, we cannot wipe poverty out overnight, but there are many things that we can do to make school a stronger equalizer than it is today. One of those would be to have reduced class sizes in the schools that serve poor children. Another would be to have universal pre-kindergarten. We should have a strong arts program in every one of these schools, because children have to have a reason to come to school other than just to be tested. She said, I was just in Pittsburgh and in Philadelphia. These schools are under-resourced. The schools in Philadelphia, they're closing all the libraries. They've laid off guidance counselors. I mean, all the things that kids need to help them succeed are being taken away. The kids that we're trying to help the most are getting the least, is what she says. And that's really the gist of the interview that she had about her new book called Reign of Error. I thought it was very interesting, and again, I thank Betsy for sending me the link. And obviously, Betsy is a school teacher. She's a middle school teacher in Texas. And she's of the opinion, obviously, that poverty and education are jointly a problem. And I think she feels, as I do, as if her thinking has won over an important ally in the conversion of Diane Ravitch, and so do I. Diane Ravitch has, over the years, done some of the best research on education, on public education, that's being done in the country. She's well respected, even by people who don't necessarily agree with her. But, of course, it's interesting of late that many of the things that she disagreed with before she supports now, which is putting additional resources into our public school system and not supporting a privatization alternative, which for a long time has been the move, has been the move in public education. The idea that if you create a private school alternative to public schools and parents begin to take their kids out as they can afford to do, as they can afford it, out of public schools and put them in private schools, that's going to force the public schools to improve their quality. The fact of the matter is there's much more to it than that. I think Diane Ravitch realizes it, as does Betsy, and as do I. I think it's a very, very important point, and I just wanted to, first of all, acknowledge and thank Betsy for sending me the link, the email, and also for the opportunity to share this thinking on Diane Ravitch's new book with you. And I don't exactly know when Reign of Error is coming out, but of course it's a play on the very famous Reign of Terror in 18th century France. In calling it Reign of Error, her suggestion obviously is that many of the things that we thought were ways to fix public education over the last 15 or 20 years in America have actually been mistakes. And I think she's an important ally. I think she has a lot to say, and I'm kind of looking forward to her book coming out so that I can read a little bit about it and see what she's got to say that might be new and might be different. As I mentioned, I'm teaching a university class here in Southern West Virginia this semester. And last week, I gave an exam to my class, and I returned the exam on Friday. And very honestly, I'll share with you that some of the grades were not good. A couple of them were, but very honestly, not enough of the students did well. And so today I returned the exams on Monday, and I think there was, kind of a note of shock in the classroom when I returned the exams on Friday. Nobody said a whole lot, but when I walked into class this morning, I think the shock had pretty well passed, and the students were laying for me about the exam. And we spent good portion of our class time this morning talking about those exams and talking about expectations and all the rest of it. And, you know, very honestly, I relish the opportunity to do that, because when students bring the issue to the table, basically they, you know, when they express this kind of interest in it. And again, I think it reinforces the idea that many of the things that we might say about education generally are just that. They're very general statements that students are kind of disconnected from until they actually get their own exam, until it's actually about them. And now that I've returned an exam with comments on it and have put a grade on it of some kind, now all of a sudden students feel that they have some that they have some skin in the game, so to speak, and now they're much more willing to engage in conversation about what's expected and what's not expected and what is fair to expect and all of these things. So we had what I thought was a very, very engaging conversation in class this morning. Basically, the reason I mentioned that is because I'm tying into the review of Diane Ravitch's book that we just finished. I think we're on that topic, and it seemed to be very appropriate to just continue with this. The major issue under discussion this morning was the issue of analysis. The issue of getting away from the information per se to the meaning of the information. And the way, and I'm going to share this with you, the way that I phrased the exam questions, I selected a number of topics from our first unit in the course. A number of them, what I thought were the major issues and the major concepts and the major principles. Things like community and the relationship internationally between a nation's power and its wealth. The origin of the idea of colonies, the idea of nations competing with each other for control of the world's wealth, the extent to which the economic rivalry between nations for control of the world's wealth oftentimes leads to military conflict. We talked about a lot of those things. So many of the concepts that I asked students about related to these things, which we covered. And what I asked them was, I asked them to identify the item. In other words, tell me what it is, whatever it happened to be. One of the questions, for example, was Thomas Jefferson's self-evident truths as revealed in the Declaration of Independence. And the Enlightenment. In other words, what I asked them to do was relate Jefferson's self-evident truths to the idea, to the phenomenon that we know in Western history as the Enlightenment. And I asked them to comment on that. So what I was after is, what are Jefferson's self-evident truths, and what is their significance? In other words, why should we, as students of this particular period, why should we know about Jefferson's idea of self-evident truths, that certain things are absolutely true and self-evident to people who will take the time to look? What does that say? What do we learn about our past by using that term as a way to gain entry into that particular portion of the past? And I gave a whole series of those questions. Identify and give the significance of. Tell what it is and why it's important to an understanding of the period we've been studying. And I pointed out before the exam that I had every expectation that every student in there would recognize every question, every term. But I was not just after what the term is, recognition. I was after understanding. And the only way I could basically assess the degree to which a student understood the relevance of a term is when the student took that item or that term and related it back into the period that produced it. In other words, put it back into its own historical context. That is a very, very difficult procedure. That's hard. And I shared with students prior to the exam the fact that it was extremely hard. It's extremely difficult. Part of the reason that it's so difficult is because more often than not, we're not asked to do it. More often than not, we are told what the significance of a particular item is. That's part of the class. That's part of the lecture, or that's what the textbook is for, to tell us this happened and it's important for this reason. And so in a sense, what we've had is an officially acceptable interpretation of the past, whether it be by textbook or whether it be by lecture of a particular instructor. What I'm suggesting to students is you need to think and you need to reflect and you need to do the analysis and you need to draw your own conclusions as to what the significance of particular issues and particular items is all about. And as you relate these terms, these phrases, if you will, or concepts, back into the period which produced them, you are revealing the depth with which you understand the period we're studying. The only way that I can assess how well you know the period is when you take particular pieces of information and are able to elaborate on them as symbolic of the period which produced them. And that's the issue that students have difficulty with. And I had told them knowing what it is a very, very insignificant part of the issue, because knowing what it is in large part memory. Understanding why it's important is well beyond memory. It gets into the issue of understanding and depth and analytical competence. And that is the issue that defines a quality education, and I don't care where it is, whether it's in West Virginia or Harvard or Oxford or Stanford or the University of Michigan or the University of Chicago or anywhere else. Being able to do that, being able to use one's common sense, one's logic, one's thinking ability, one's ability to reason in order to understand complex phenomena is the height of what a quality education is all about. And the point that I tried to make this morning is to not require it is disgraceful, because it is the determining factor in quality education. The ability to think and reason and understand and conceptualize and play what-if alternative games with history. In other words, what would have happened if this didn't happen but something else happened? And what you're doing is you're asking students to conjure up whole different scenarios, and in the process you're able to evaluate how well they understand what happened by the way they piece the information together. This is the kind of education that Plato talked about when he talked about the kind of knowledge that already exists within mankind. The trick is to find a way to get it out. The trick is not to introduce new pieces of information and call it education. That's not education. Education is what you do with the information presented. The information itself is not the education. The facts are not education. The level of understanding that you derive from engaging these facts, that's the understanding. And our education system has got to be willing to demand those things from our students. And if we don't, our schools will continue to fail. And I would suggest to you that not only is this very difficult for students, especially if they've never been asked to do it before, it's very threatening to society because it gets us into the issue of students thinking rather than some outside authority telling them what to think. It's honing their skills to be able to reason and do analysis for themselves. When you ask students to do that, you give up, you surrender the right to dictate the conclusions they reach. You've got to be willing to accept new definitions of truth as students understand them, provided they follow the proper academic and intellectual procedures necessary to support their point of view. One of my students asked this morning a question because they're working on a paper right now. And he said, are we allowed to offer an opinion? I thought that was a wonderful question. Because the answer to that question is, oh, indeed, I am asking you for your opinion. The difference is opinion without evidence is unsupported opinion. Opinion with evidence is interpretation. It is argumentative substance. It is a point of view with evidence. That's what we're after. Opinions without evidence are meaningless. Everybody's got one. Everybody has a right to one. But none of us have to take them seriously. But when you can basically offer your opinion on a particular issue's meaning, and you can lay out chapter and verse as to why you think that and why you believe that there is sufficient evidence to support the interpretation that you have put out there, that's where we want to go. That's what happens in the very best schools, colleges, and universities and graduate schools in the world. And every student can do that. Every student doesn't have the same skill level. The skills aren't as polished. But every living being can think and can reason and can understand. Anybody, when you're visiting a strange town, a neighborhood, or a place that you've never been before, and you go to the grocery store, a grocery store that you've never been in before, watch people who do that. We are very successful as citizens in this society. We are very successful at navigating grocery stores. And the reason is because most of us have spent a good portion of our lives in and out of grocery stores, shopping with our parents when they used to take us, sending us to the store to buy things for them, etc., etc., etc. Like school itself, most of us have been in and out of grocery stores all our lives. And what that means is we know how to negotiate a grocery store, even if we've never been in it before. We know that certain things tend to be in the same aisles. We know that there is an aisle for pet foods, and there's an aisle for cereals, and there's another aisle for canned vegetables, and there's another aisle for something else. We know that. So depending on what it is we're after, we know exactly where to go in the grocery store to find it. Not just certain people, not just the people that get A's and B's in our schools can navigate grocery stores. Everybody can navigate a grocery store. Everybody can navigate a drugstore or a convenience store. Because the fact of the matter is they're all organized around the same principles, and we know what those principles are. Therefore, we can navigate even though it's totally new territory for us. What does that tell us? It tells us that people are not incapable of thinking and reasoning and understanding and making conclusions and making intelligent guesses and saying, I'm not sure, I've never been in the store before, I'm not sure where this item is, but usually it's in that aisle over there because that's usually what it goes with. And so you're making intelligent guesses, hypotheses. And you're saying, from what I know, it's probably over there. You could be wrong, but chances are you're not. Everybody can do this. Everybody can think. Everybody can reason. Everybody can connect things once they find out what it is that makes the connection possible. Now, again, everybody doesn't have the same skill levels. Everybody's not as polished. Everybody doesn't write as well. Everybody doesn't make their case as well as everybody else. We know that. But everybody can do it, and everybody can learn. The problem is, our problem has been, we are afraid to trust people to take control of their own learning because we want to be able to control their conclusions. We want to know that when people leave our classrooms, they're going to believe certain things about certain principles. And so therefore, the only way that we've concluded we can do that is to take the interpretations of information and treat them as if they were fact, and present the interpretations as truth just as we present the facts as truth. So that what we're turning out are students that can't figure out the difference between fact and interpretation, because we've confused the two throughout the years. The only thing many of our students know is that a lot of the stuff doesn't make any sense, but you can't say anything because if you do, you're punished. And so the best thing to do is just keep your mouth shut and go along and pretend that it makes sense. And hopefully you can get out alive. I would suggest to you that's a pretty frightening approach to education of young people. It doesn't show a whole lot of respect on the ability of young people to think and reason for themselves. And the fact that even at the university level, students continue to resist this because they've never been asked to do it. Well, not never, I shouldn't say that. Chances are that they haven't been asked to do this before, at least very often. It's something new for them. It's frightening because there's not a right answer. There's something very reassuring about right answers. When you get it, somebody tells you you're right, that's it. It's a reinforcement. But the fact of the matter is, for many of our students, they never get the right answer. Their entire life as students consists of a series of right answers that other people always get, they never get. How demeaning and defeating that kind of an existence as a student is. I would suggest to you that this is a very, very important consideration. It's what we're doing here at the Virtual Center. It's what I believe we're doing here. The reason that I wanted to do a program on the Constitution of the United States and civic responsibility is because I believe once you take the information and you get into its meaning and its implications, etc., everybody can understand this. Not just scholars, not just graduate students, not just the people at the most prestigious and expensive universities and graduate schools and law schools in the country or in the world. But everybody can think and understand and reason. Everybody can understand, for example, the concept of community and why it is absolutely essential for any government to do anything and everything that it can do in order to create and build a sense of community. Because it stands to reason that no government can expect to last if it has to militarily and physically enforce every piece of legislation, every law that it passes. If government knows going in that there's going to be massive popular resistance to everything that government does or doesn't do, then the only alternative government has is to impose its will on its own people. And history tells us that you can only do that for so long. Eventually, those governments are going to fall. The only way that a government can last and hope to be even reasonably popular is when its decisions and its rules and its laws conform to what people want, what people expect, what people believe to be true. In other words, the extent to which government is following the common ideals and ideas of the people to be governed. As long as government is doing that, it's kind of like sitting in church on a Sunday morning. Rarely do we see a situation at a Sunday service where the congregation stands up en masse and walks out of the service because the pastor or the preacher has said something that the vast majority of the congregation doesn't agree with. That never happens. The whole idea of delivering a sermon, the way that a good sermon is organized, is to fit into and cater to the belief system of the people sitting in the congregation. By reinforcing what they believe and what they want to believe and what they know to be true, and giving them reasons, additional reasons to believe that what they already know is true, you are strengthening people's faith. You are strengthening their commitment to the particular denominational set of beliefs that they had subscribed to. You're strengthening their commitment to that congregation. You're strengthening their support for you as their preacher or their pastor. And you're strengthening the degree of community within the members of that congregation. You're basically giving all of the people in that congregation common themes and common truths to accept and engage and agree to. You're building a sense of community. And the result is, as you continue to build that week after week after week, your sermons become more popular, your congregation becomes stronger in their faith, the congregation becomes much more united and much stronger, and much more willing to support you as their leader, as their pastor. And that's really what it's all about. Government is the same way. Government must find ways to build a sense of community. It must find ways to strengthen commonalities within the governing body, within the people to be governed, within the citizenry. And it needs to do everything it can to reinforce those common themes and to support them and to celebrate them and to basically praise them when the people in the community reflect behavior that honors them. And the degree to which government is successful in doing that is the degree to which we can measure a government as being successful or not successful. That's what good government is about. The most cynical person who deals with these kinds of things in history, I think, is probably Machiavelli. Students love Machiavelli because he's so outspoken. He says some unbelievable things that people want to believe, people know anyway, but he's the only one that would dare say them. And basically, the things that Machiavelli says to the prince, the advice that he gives the prince is, it's okay to believe certain things and know certain things not to be true, but you've got to make sure that you don't convey those to your citizens. You've got to give them what they want to hear, because your number one goal is for them to support you and be willing to do what you want them to do. And the only way you can do that is to play to their strengths and their belief system and the rest of it, even if you don't believe it yourself. So Machiavelli openly says, if you need to be a hypocrite in order to be a popular prince, then be a hypocrite. Students love that. They love to hear that because it's so honest. The fact of the matter is, building community is very important. Therefore, knowing what community is and why it's important is an important part of our education. To consciously know that and not require it because it's difficult for students to understand is doing a disservice to them and a disservice to education itself. And again, I really believe, and I want to bring this diatribe to a close because I've gone further than I intended to go when I came on the air today, but I really mean this. It is absolutely essential that we begin to recognize the fact that everybody can think and everybody can reason, and that's what we need to do in our world today. Is we need to basically grow this and strengthen it and encourage it and reinforce it on the part of our students, all of our students. We're at 53 minutes after the hour. We've got about 5 minutes before we're going to take a 5-minute break here and then launch into our second hour. Let me introduce a theme, and then when we come back after our break, we can kind of develop this theme a little bit. I wanted to do a little bit today with rights. If you remember a couple of weeks ago, we started on the whole issue of rights and responsibilities of citizens. And what I've done in the interim is I've gone to the well, so to speak. I've gone to a number of places where I can get my hands on bills of rights and documents that seem to be examples of and illustrations of the kinds of rights that most of us can buy into and most of us subscribe to. We began last week when we looked at the Declaration of Independence. And we looked at the very relevant paragraph toward the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, when Jefferson lays out the rationale for limited government and citizen rights. And Jefferson talked about what he called self-evident truths. And again, we talked about the extent to which this comes directly out of the Enlightenment period. And the dominant theme of the Enlightenment period, as we know, is human reason. And those that we call regularly call Enlightenment thinkers and Enlightenment philosophers, people like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and many of the others. The dominant theme of these people is that man's reason, man's common sense, man's ability to think will lead him to the truth. And from that, we come to the conclusion that the Enlightenment movement argued or posited the belief system that truth is not revealed, truth is discovered. Truth isn't something that somebody tells you. Truth is something that you figure out for yourself as a result of your ability to think and to reason and to compare and contrast and evaluate and rank and assess. Going back to Plato, which I mentioned before, Plato, in his Republic, made the point that knowledge, the knowledge worth having, the things that man needs to know, are already within us because we have the ability to think and we have the ability to process and the ability to reason and the ability to figure things out for ourselves. But when somebody tells you something is true, they eliminate the need for thinking. All you need to do is believe. And so the Enlightenment thinkers believed that the greatest detriment of the medieval period was the fact that the medieval period was based on the assumption that all of God's truths were revealed to man through Scripture. Think about that. Everything that's worth knowing is already known. All you have to do is memorize it. All you have to do is listen while somebody tells you what to believe. There's no effort necessary on your part. There's no reason to question. There's no reason to doubt. There's no reason to ask for more evidence. The only option that we have is to believe. The medieval period was based on the assumption that God had revealed all of his truths, everything that man needed to know through Scripture. All that was necessary was for somebody to tell us what it was we were supposed to believe. And in the medieval period, the Catholic Church did that. The challenge to that worldview is the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment idea is that God's truths are not revealed, they are to be discovered. And they are to be discovered by every individual whom God has given a mind to. God has given the ability to think and reason for ourselves. And the only way that we can be honest with the gifts that God has given us is to use them. And the idea is through our reason, through our common sense, through our ability to think, through our ability to do research, through our ability to find out more, to want to know more, we can understand the universe that God created. It's not beyond human understanding. There are laws that govern the universe. There are laws that govern the planets, the laws of gravity, the laws which govern the universe. We can know them, we can understand them, and what that means is we can know God. We can understand how God thinks because God wants us to think the way He does. That's the premise of education that comes out of the Enlightenment. Somehow we have lost that. And we have taken our education system and we have redefined it in a way which is very similar to the medieval period. We have taken to telling our students what truth is. And in the process, we have destroyed the kind of self-confidence that they need in order to seek truth and understanding for themselves. We have consistently told them, we have marked them wrong, we have put big red X's through what they think. And what we have done over time is we have convinced them that the safest way to be successful in our education system is to not guess and not think and not be wrong. Rather to sit there and be silent and wait until somebody tells you what the right answers are. And that becomes the modus operandi for our education system. It is frightening. With that, we have reached the top of our first hour here at the Virtual Center. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll start to look at the issue of rights. I want to go back to Jefferson's self-evident truths, and I want to spend time looking at the Virginia Bill of Rights, which was drafted principally by George Mason in June of 1776, a document which Thomas Jefferson bought into. Most people believe that the Declaration, which he wrote in July, was directly derived from the document created less than a month before. But first, let's take a break. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien. This is the Head On Radio Network. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien, and if you've been with us through our entire program today, I thank you for staying with us. I have a phone ringing in the background, which I don't plan to answer right now. But I thank you for staying with us if you've been with us, and if you're just joining us, welcome. We're going to be in our second hour today, we're going to be into the issue of rights. And looking at bills of rights, I have to confess that this is a passion of mine for a number of reasons. When I wrote my dissertation many years ago, actually in the 1970s, I was writing my dissertation in the 1970s, and I received my degree in 1979. So you know, it's been a while. But I got into the issue of the Bill of Rights. And what I was looking at, I was writing principally on the state of Maryland and its ratification of the Constitution of the United States. And what I was looking at is the idea of amending the Constitution and the strategies adopted by the Anti-Federalists as a way to try to amend the Constitution in order to take out from it some of the most what the Anti-Federalists believe were the most dangerous tendencies in terms of the powers given to the federal government under the Constitution. And so at that point I began to look at rights. And one of the things I began to look at is the extent to which the way these rights are expressed tends to change depending on what the agenda is of the people who speak to those rights. And that's kind of what I want to get into today. It's a little bit theoretical, and I apologize for that. I guess what I'm saying is we're going to be dealing to an extent with some things that are pretty abstract. But at the same time, I believe that they're very important, and I hope that in this hour, I can basically demonstrate the hows and whys of what I really believe is necessary in order to really get on top of and get our arms around the issue of rights and responsibilities in our contemporary society. We have a phone number. I really do encourage you to participate actively in our program by sharing your ideas and your comments with me and with our listeners. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me directly, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. As I mentioned, I'd like to begin today with the Declaration of Independence, which we covered last week. Actually, if you think about it, a few weeks ago we looked in some detail at the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, which was approved in 1641 in Massachusetts. And the reason that I wanted to spend as much time on that particular document as I did is because it is considered to be the most comprehensive treatment of rights and responsibilities ever existed, that was ever put together. And part of the reason, as we mentioned at the time, part of the reason it's so comprehensive is because Massachusetts in the 17th century, before the 18th century movement for independence, Massachusetts was settled as what we call a theocracy. Man's law and God's law were considered to be inseparable. Man's duty in writing and approving laws was to make sure that those laws mirrored God's laws, God's will. The result is that the Massachusetts Body of Liberties took no pains to separate what we call civil rights from what we call natural rights or unalienable rights or absolute rights or whatever term you want to use. Jefferson used the words unalienable rights. But of course, we continue to argue in our society even today about the different kinds of these rights. We have rights that we call substantive, which means that they are rights in and of themselves. Then we have other rights which we call procedural rights. Right, in our society, the rights to trial by jury, the rights to confront our accusers, the right to present evidence, the right to hear the evidence against us, the right to an attorney, the right to a speedy trial, the right to be tried by a jury of our peers in the community in which we live. One of the things that bothered the colonists tremendously were when England enacted what are called admiralty courts. And the idea is that if a member of, a citizen of Massachusetts or one of the other colonies violated British law, violated the Navigation Acts, for example, they were not tried in their local courts with local juries because the British believed that it was a joke and that the local people were just going to let them off. So by setting up admiralty courts, vice admiralty courts, what the British did was take the accused out of the community he or she lived in and try them in a faraway place by a jury or before a judge over which there was no local control. And this, to the colonists, was a violation of everything that they took, every right that they had taken for granted. And so these procedural rights are part of what we subscribe to today. And that's the reason why I wanted to spend some time on the Massachusetts Body of Liberties of 1641, because it's just a compendium. There are 98 specific items in that document. And what that means is it's just a litany of procedural rights, human rights, God-given rights, all of them lumped together. It's very comprehensive. And as my friend John Kaminsky commented to me a number of years ago, there's no Bill of Rights that I've ever seen where the right in question was not mentioned in the Massachusetts Body of Liberty somewhere. So everything that exists, theoretically, is contained within that particular document. But what I want to do today is look at Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. And the reason is because most people believe that Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and its effort to identify and articulate what he called unalienable rights is extremely important in our whole political way of looking at the world. Because not only did Jefferson address these rights, but Jefferson also addressed the origins of government, the Enlightenment thinking in terms of the legitimate origins of government, and the fact that government's power, rationally speaking, using logic and common sense, government's power was limited specifically to the protection of man's unalienable rights. And that was the way that you measure good government, by the extent to which government limits its power to the consent of the governed. That government's powers are limited strictly to the powers which the people who create government are willing to give it. And that's what Jefferson's famous paragraph toward the beginning of the Declaration of Independence is all about. And so if you'll bear with me, I'd like to read it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed, Jefferson says, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. You don't exercise this right of revolution unless the issues are really serious. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. What Jefferson is saying there is that history, all experience, tells us that man will put up with a lot before he will undertake the abolition of government itself. But then Jefferson goes on to explain the current situation that the colonies find themselves in. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient suffrage of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And then comes the extensive list of charges, specific charges against the king, all of them designed to make the case that the king has acted in a tyrannical manner to such a degree and has ignored the pleas and the offers of compromise from the colonies to such a degree that the colonies really have no option left except to exercise their legitimate rights to abolish a government that has overstepped its legitimate bounds of authority and to create a new government which will conform to and subscribes to the rights and responsibilities which the people are willing to give it. And so Jefferson's Declaration is not a Bill of Rights. It is a statement of justification for colonial independence from the mother country. It is a political document that includes philosophical truths, what Jefferson calls self-evident truths. Pieces of information that are readily accepted as part of the Enlightenment. The idea that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator, by God, with certain unalienable rights. Governments are created to protect these rights, but the rights do not come from the government. The rights come from God. The rights belong to man because they are human beings, because they are alive. And, of course, the emphasis on life, liberty, and property is very important. That's taken almost directly from the writings of John Locke. What I wanted to point out to you is not the substance of these rights so much as the way they are expressed. And this, I probably am going to get myself in trouble, so hang in there with me because this is somewhat difficult to explain. When Jefferson says that these truths are self-evident, and then he begins to lay out what these truths are, the optimum word that he introduces each part with is the word that. These are self-evident truths. What are they? One, that all men are created equal. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are created among men, deriving their power from the consent of the government. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter and abolish. So what Jefferson is laying out is a series of self-evident truths. That this is true. That is true. That something else is true. He is not saying we declare them to be true. He's not saying that our Congress declares them to be true. He is basically saying these are self-evident truths that everybody knows are true. So what he is doing in this paragraph is expressing the truths that thinking people accept as givens. Okay. Hold that for a moment. If we go back to June of 1776, the Virginia legislature adopted a Declaration of Rights in June of 1776, less than a month before Jefferson drafted that declaration. Most people focus on the content of the truths, of the rights. I want, for a moment, to focus on the way the rights are expressed. So if you'll bear with me. The Virginia Declaration of Rights begins by saying, a declaration of rights made by the representatives of the good people of Virginia, assembled in full and free convention, which rights do pertain to them and their posterity, as the basis and foundation of government. What this document says then is, these rights are the basis and the foundation of government. These are statements of absolute rights that people have because they're people, because they're alive. So let's listen to the way that these are explained. Section 1. And I might tell you that there are 16 sections to this document. Section 1, Chapter 1, Item 1, whatever you want to call it. Here's the first one. That all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot, by any compact, deprive or divest their posterity, namely, the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. First of all, take a moment and appreciate the detail of that first item. Obviously, Jefferson's Declaration streamlined it, made it much more succinct. And what Jefferson left us with in the Declaration is the need to speculate as to what he might have meant by the way he expressed these unalienable rights. But here in this document, there's nothing left to speculation. It's all laid out here in black and white. That all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights, unalienable rights. Inherent means that they are rights that exist within themselves. They aren't rights given to them by anybody. They are rights that they possess because they are alive. They are human beings, of which, when they enter into society, into a state of society, they cannot, by any compact, deprive or divest their posterity. In other words, these rights are inherent within them. They can't give them away. They can't sign them away. They can't deprive the next generation of these same rights. They can't divest their posterity of them. They can't say, we'll have them, but our children will not. If they are inherent rights, then they belong to all people who are alive, whatever generation they live in. Namely, the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. I would suggest to you that while that is very complete, if people are naturally equally free and independent and have certain rights which even when they enter society they cannot give away, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property, it seems to suggest very clearly that there is something approaching equality of opportunity implied in that document. It doesn't say that certain people will have the means of acquiring and possessing property. It's that everybody will have the opportunity to acquire and possess property. And everybody will have the opportunity to pursue and obtain happiness and safety. It is, I would argue, a much clearer statement of society's commitment to equality than exists in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. However, it was written within a month. The two documents were written within a month of each other. One would have to conclude that because the Declaration of Independence is rather vague and doesn't go into this much specific detail, is it possible that the Declaration is a step back from the commitment of the Virginia Declaration of Rights the previous month? Or is it more likely that to interpret these within Jefferson's Declaration is probably consistent with what he and the rest of the people in Virginia that adopted this Declaration of Rights in June meant? I am comfortable with the fact that what Jefferson implies in the Declaration by mentioning equality first, even before he gets into the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property, he said that all men are created equal. It's first. I would suggest that's very consistent with the first section of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which is a much clearer statement of principle and mission, suggesting that equality and society's need to promote equality is far more important to Jefferson than those who interpret his document are willing to grant him. We have had a real problem throughout our history with Jefferson's Declaration around especially based on the issue of equality. The person in our history that probably made the most of this after the founders was Abraham Lincoln. Many people today believe that Lincoln ought to be considered in the same context with the founders, because Lincoln, 100 years after the fact, breathed new life into the ideals of the Declaration, into the ideals of the founders. And if you look at this document drafted in June in Virginia, primarily by George Mason, it seems to me to suggest a much clearer, more pronounced commitment to equality than does the Declaration. I personally don't believe that it's incorrect to read that commission, that mission, into the Declaration of Independence, because I know that within the month Jefferson had subscribed to exactly that in this Declaration of Rights of June 1776. I think that first item is very revealing for its content. I think it adds flesh to the bones of the Declaration of Independence. It tells us what the founders meant by what they said. And it becomes much more difficult to deny the commitment to equality in the Declaration when you're familiar with this document. The next section of the Virginia Declaration of Rights proceeds from that all power is vested in and consequently derived from the people. That magistrates are their trustees and servants, and at all times amenable to them. There's absolutely no question in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, item 2, where power comes from, what the role of the people is, and what the role of the elected representative is. that all power is vested in and consequently derived from the people, that magistrates are their trustees and servants and at all times amenable to them. Remember in 1645, when called before the General Court of Massachusetts, Governor John Winthrop argued that the magistrates, while they were called by the people to serve, were amenable to God, not to the people who elected them. This document is saying that the magistrates are answerable to the people. They are the trustees and servants of the people. They are not elected to make decisions for the people. They are elected to carry out the will of the people. The Declaration of Independence was written within a month of this document. It seems to me that we have to take the content of this document seriously when interpreting the Declaration. They are so close together. There's no evidence to suggest that Jefferson or anybody else had a change of mind between June and July in terms of the way to write this document. Section 3 of the Virginia Declaration. That government is or ought to be instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people, nation, or community. Please hear. That government is or ought to be instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people, nation, or community, of all the various modes and forms of government, that is best which is capable of producing the greatest degree of happiness and safety, and is most effectually secured against the danger of maladministration. And that, when any government shall be found inadequate or contrary to these purposes, a majority of the community has an indubitable, inalienable, and indefeasible right to reform, alter, or abolish it in such manner as shall be judged most conducive to the public weal. Please note in section number 3 that the idea that government is created principally to protect private property, which is what people choose to see in the Declaration, is not reiterated here. Government's responsibility, the reason that it's created, is to promote the public benefit, the common benefit, the security of the nation, the people, or the community, not the rights of the wealthy, not the rights of the property owners. And that mode of government is best which is capable of producing the greatest happiness and safety for the community or the nation or the people, not the best interests of the wealthy, of the 1%. Section 4, that no man or set of men is entitled to exclusive or separate emoluments or privileges from the community, but in consideration of public services, which not being descendable, neither ought the offices of magistrate, legislator, or judge to be hereditary. The purpose of public service is public service, not private right, not private job, not the right to look at the position you hold as your own private property. Nobody, this fourth item says, is entitled to exclusive or separate rights or privileges that are any different from any other member of the community. And that once they hold a position of public service, The office of magistrate, legislator, or judge is not to be hereditary. It is to be exactly what they say it is, which is a public service. Section 5, that the legislative and executive powers of the state should be separate and distinct from the judiciary, and that the members of the two first, the legislature and executive, may be restrained from oppression by feeling and participating the burdens of the people. They should, at fixed periods, be reduced to a private station, return into that body from which they were originally taken, and the vacancies be supplied by frequent, certain, and regular elections, in which all or any part of the former members to be again eligible or ineligible as the laws shall direct. The emphasis here is to make sure that those elected to serve never get far away from the people they represented, they were elected to represent, to the point that at fixed periods they should be reduced to a private station. In other words, they should be forced to go back into the community at large so that they don't lose touch with the people that they represent. They don't hold office for so long and are so separate from the people who elect them that they have lost touch, a sensitivity, lost a sense of knowing what the people they represent want or need. That's Section 5. Section 6, that elections of members to serve as representatives of the people in assembly ought to be free, and that all men having sufficient evidence of permanent common interest with and attachment to the community have the right of suffrage and cannot be taxed or deprived of their property for public uses without their own consent or that of their representatives so elected, nor bound by any law to which they have not in like manner assembled for the public good. Everybody who can demonstrate that they are part of the community has a right to vote. Now, what they do, what many of the colonies do, is they establish property qualifications for voting and office holding, and they say the only way to demonstrate that you are a member of the community and that you have a commitment to the community is if you own property, if you have what they call a stake in society, if you have something to lose. And if you can demonstrate that, then you have the right. Then you have the right to vote. The point I'm making, and I'm going into a lot of detail here. It's important to be aware of the trees in the forest, but it's also important to be aware of the forest. What do I mean by that? Notice that this document is a declaration of rights. It is a statement of rights that people have. It is not a statement of the rights that people in this society will have. It is not a statement of rights that the government of this society chooses to give people. It is a statement of the rights that people possess because they are people and they live in this community. And the way that is expressed is that every section, every item begins with the word that. This is a declaration of rights made by the representatives of the people of Virginia. And it speaks to the rights that pertain to them and their posterity and future generations as the basis of foundation and government. And here are these statements of fact: that all men are created equal, equally free and independent. that they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity of these rights. They can't give them away. That all power is vested in and derived from the people. That magistrates are their trustees and servants. That government is or ought to be instituted for the common benefit, protection of the people, the nation, or the community. No mention here of specific people having more rights. In fact, Section 4 says that no man or set of men is entitled to exclusive or separate emoluments or privileges from the community at large. Everybody needs to be treated the same. Every one of these statements begins with the word that. What that means is they are statement of absolute fact. What the Virginia delegates are doing is declaring that these rights for citizens, for people, are the foundation and the basis of government. If you look at the states that ratify the Constitution of the United States, many of these states ratify with the idea that there ought to be a Bill of Rights added to the new Constitution. Many of the Federalists argued that a Bill of Rights was not necessary because many of the states had Bills of Rights already, and that people's rights were protected by their states, by their state governments. But the anti-federalist response to that was, if this new government is to have power over the states, then it's important that this new government acknowledge that the people have the same rights as the state constitutions acknowledged, as the Virginia Declaration of Rights stated in this document, which becomes part of the Virginia Constitution. These are statements of fact. We are at 12 minutes of the hour. I think it's time to move toward a conclusion here, and we can pick up on this and continue it tomorrow. Please think about the extent to which these statements of fact are the intent of these declaration, these rights. I now share with you the first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States, our Bill of Rights. Number 1, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Please notice the difference in tone, in wording. Notice that this First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, our Bill of Rights, does not state absolute fact. Rather, it is an acknowledgement by the new federal government that Congress will not make a law establishing religion or prohibiting the free exercise of religion or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people to freely assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. What's the difference? I would suggest to you the difference is huge. Because rather than being a statement of the rights that people have because they are people, because they are human beings, and because they live, the way the Bill of Rights is phrased, Congress is limiting its power to interfere with religious freedom or freedom of the press, or freedom of the speech, or the right of people to peaceably assemble. But the Bill of Rights is not declaring that people have absolute rights to those things. What the Bill of Rights says is that Congress will not make a law abridging any of these things. The implication is that the only limitations on the power of government in the Bill of Rights are self-limitations. Government is agreeing that it will not do things to these rights, but it does not state that they are absolute. It does not state that they are inalienable. It does not state that they are inherent. It does not state that they are natural. It states that these are rights which this society chooses to concede to its citizens. To the point that when the Supreme Court begins to interpret the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in later years, the Supreme Court can say, government can say, that only citizens can claim protection under the Bill of Rights. Because there's nothing in the Constitution that speaks to the absolute nature of these rights to human beings. That's what the Massachusetts Body of Liberties of 1641 did. That's what the Virginia Declaration of Rights of June 1776 did. That's what the Declaration of Independence in July of 1776 did. It stated the realities of rights that people have because they are people. I would suggest to you that every state that ratified the Constitution, and along with its vote of ratification, included amendments that it suggested ought to be added to the Constitution, every one of those statements were phrased like the Virginia Declaration of Rights and like the Declaration of Independence. They are statements of self-evident truths. That this is true, that that's true, that these are what people want. The Constitution of the United States contains none of that. There's no mention in the Constitution of the United States or the Bill of Rights of anything close, even resembling unalienable rights. All of these rights are relative. None of them are absolute. And then we get to Amendment number 2, which is creating all the flap today. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Does that mean that the right to bear arms is an absolute right? It does not. In fact, it says just the opposite. It says that because a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of the state, people must have access to arms. It does not say that the people have an absolute or God-given right to bear weapons or to have a tank in their front yard or anything else. In fact, if you look at the Virginia Declaration of Rights, number 13, this is what the Virginia Declaration of Rights says about the militia. That a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people, trained to arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. That standing armies in time of peace should be avoided as dangerous to liberty, and that in all cases the military should be under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. There's nothing in there about the absolute right to bear arms, but there's everything in there about people's responsibility to defend the nation and come to the defense of the nation by serving in the militia and having access to arms in order to do that. What I'm suggesting is that we have witnessed and continue to witness people who are choosing to misinterpret the founders. And this primarily from people who claim, Justice Scalia, that we must go back to the founders in order to try to attain or to tune into the original intent of the founders. But when it comes to this, they don't want to go to the original intent, because the original intent has nothing to do with the absolute right to bear arms. And if you look at the origin of the Second Amendment and the origin of the Supreme Court cases that have been heard in recent years about people's right to own a gun, you can begin to see the conscious political effort that was made over the last 30 and 40 years to build the judicial precedents in order to base a case for the absolute right to bear arms on those previous decisions. This idea of the NRA's idea of the right to bear arms is a political creation of the right. It has no basis at all in the intent of the founders. The founders didn't talk about it. The founders didn't talk about the right to bear arms as being absolute, because at the time everybody hunted, everybody protected themselves from Indians and other natural predators, wild animals. Everybody was armed. It was taken for granted that people would have arms. There was no mention of it in the Constitution. There was no intent. But my suggestion, my point is that in the Bill of Rights, the phrasing of these rights is done in such a way that there's no way that the Supreme Court could ever come back and interpret anything resembling inalienable rights into the Constitution of the United States. Item 3. No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. It doesn't say that man's home is his castle and the troops can't be quartered there. It says that in a manner to be prescribed by law, troops can be quartered in private homes if the public interest requires it. So the idea that your home is your absolute castle is not supportable in our Bill of Rights. Every one of these statements, please notice, does not begin with the word that, because these are not statements of absolute rights. These are concessions of the civil establishment of the Constitution itself to the citizens. These are civil rights that this particular system believes are necessary to make this system work. Every one of them can be suspended in a time of crisis. None of them are absolute. This is critically important. And it is something that all of us have chosen to overlook. We have reached the top of the hour, and I know Bob Kincaid is firing up right now. Let me say goodbye and thank you for listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. I'm Bill O'Brien. Please be safe. We'll be back tomorrow. Thank you.